For a long time, Russia believed one corner of Europe would never matter. It wasn't Germany, it wasn't Poland, and it wasn't the heavily armed Baltic states that Moscow openly considered hostile. Instead, it was a relatively quiet country on Europe's southeastern edge, sitting between the Balkans and the Black Sea. A NATO member, yes, but one the Kremlin viewed as cautious, predictable, and strategically harmless. From Moscow's point of view, this country simply didn't register as a serious military concern. Its economy was limited. Its political leadership avoided confrontation. Its armed forces relied on aging equipment inherited from the Cold War era, and its national focus appeared centered on domestic reform, not regional power. For years, Russia treated this state as background noise, present on the map, but irrelevant to real strategy. That belief would turn out to be a costly miscalculation, because while global attention remained fixed on Ukraine, Poland, and the Baltic region, something began to shift quietly along NATO's southeastern flank. And when Russia finally recognized what was happening, the transformation was already well underway. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 didn't just change battle lines. It shattered assumptions. It forced every country near Russia's borders to reassess its own vulnerability. And for this Black Sea nation, it triggered a strategic awakening. What followed wasn't a sudden burst of nationalism or a symbolic show of force. It was something far more serious. A calculated, long-term shift in how the country viewed its role in regional security. To understand why this transformation matters so much to Russia, you have to look beyond politics and focus on geography. Europe's southeastern frontier isn't defined by lines on a map. It's shaped by natural corridors, rivers, coastlines, ports, and narrow access routes that determine how armies, supplies, and influence move in times of crisis. At the center of this network lies the western Black Sea coast. This country controls access to the Danube River as it flows into the Black Sea, one of the most important logistical arteries in Europe. The Danube connects Central Europe to southeastern trade routes, energy corridors, and military transit paths. Any power that influences this gateway holds leverage far beyond its borders. Just to the north sits Moldova, a small but geopolitically sensitive state. Inside Moldova lies Transnistria, a Russian-backed separatist region hosting Russian troops. The proximity of all these elements turns this quiet NATO country into a strategic hinge point. Defense analysts across Europe agree on one thing. Control of these corridors shapes the balance of power across southeastern Europe. And after 2022, these corridors began to change hands, not through conquest, but through preparation. The Black Sea coastline adds another critical layer. From this shore, the Crimean Peninsula lies directly across the water. Modern surveillance systems positioned here don't require long warning times. Russian aircraft, naval movements, and drone launches can be detected quickly and shared across NATO networks almost instantly. This reality became impossible to ignore when Russian drones targeting Ukrainian infrastructure started crossing borders. Some malfunctioned and crashed inside NATO territory. Others exploded near civilian areas. Drone fragments landed in open fields and near villages. These weren't theoretical scenarios discussed in war rooms. They were real incidents, confirmed by Allied monitoring systems. And each one sent a clear signal: the war was no longer contained. This country didn't seek a frontline role, but geography made neutrality impossible. Moscow assumed that pressure would produce caution, that proximity to conflict would encourage restraint, that a quieter NATO member would avoid escalation. Instead, pressure produced acceleration. Radar coverage expanded rapidly. Air defense systems were activated and modernized. Coordination with NATO's integrated air and missile defense architecture intensified. But the most important shift wasn't visible from the outside. Behind the scenes, the country began rethinking its entire military posture. This wasn't about quick fixes or temporary deployments. It was a fundamental restructuring, an acknowledgement that the security environment had permanently changed. Defense planning moved away from short-term budgeting and toward long-range strategy. Spending increased significantly. Procurement plans extended far into the future. Training, interoperability, and readiness became national priorities. In effect, a country once considered passive was redefining itself. For Russia, this was the first warning sign. A state that Moscow had long ignored was no longer reacting. It was preparing. And preparation, when done inside NATO's framework, carries consequences far beyond national borders. This was only the beginning of the shift. Because as military modernization accelerated, the transformation would soon reach a level that directly challenged Russia's freedom of action in the Black Sea itself. And that is where the story truly begins to trouble the Kremlin. Before 2022, few military planners viewed this Black Sea country as a serious fighting force. Its armed forces were functional, but dated. Much of its equipment traced back to the Soviet era. Air defense systems were aging. Aircraft fleets were limited. Procurement moved slowly, constrained by tight budgets and cautious planning. In Moscow's calculations, this country could defend itself at a basic level, but it could not shape events beyond its borders. That assessment did not survive the war in Ukraine. The invasion sent a clear message to every state near Russia's borders. Standing still was no longer an option. And for this NATO member, the response wasn't incremental reform, it was acceleration. Defense spending surged rapidly, crossing NATO's benchmark and locking in long-term commitments that stretched far beyond election cycles. This wasn't emergency funding. It was strategic investment, designed to transform the military over an entire decade. The first priority was the air. Modern warfare is decided above the battlefield long before ground forces engage. Control of airspace determines surveillance, strike capability, and freedom of movement. This country understood that lesson immediately. The initial step was replacing outdated fighter aircraft with modern, NATO-standard platforms. A full fleet of F-16s was secured, not as a temporary fix, but as a bridge towards something far more significant. Then came the decision that caught Moscow's attention. Approval was granted for fifth-generation stealth aircraft, placing this country into an elite category shared by only a handful of European states. This wasn't just an upgrade. It was a leap. Military analysts across Europe agree on one point. Once a country operates fifth-generation aircraft, it stops thinking purely about territorial defense. It gains the ability to see farther, strike earlier, and integrate seamlessly into alliance-wide operations. Stealth aircraft don't just fly faster or carry better weapons. They reshape the battlefield by controlling information. They detect threats before being seen. They coordinate with drones, satellites, and naval assets in ways older platforms simply cannot. For Russia, this marked a shift from a manageable neighbor to a sophisticated opponent operating within NATO's most advanced air architecture. But the transformation didn't stop in the skies. On the ground, the overhaul was just as significant. Plans were announced to modernize armored forces with advanced main battle tanks, supported by new infantry fighting vehicles and long-range artillery systems. These weren't isolated purchases. They were part of integrated force packages designed for modern combined arms warfare. One of the most notable aspects of this modernization was the choice of partners. Rather than relying on a single supplier, the country entered deep defense partnerships with advanced industrial powers in both Europe and Asia. These agreements went far beyond buying equipment. They included training, maintenance, technology transfer, and future production capacity. In practical terms, this meant the armed forces weren't just receiving hardware, they were absorbing modern combat doctrine. That distinction matters. A military that buys equipment without doctrine remains dependent. A military that integrates training, logistics, and command structures becomes resilient. And resilience is what began to worry Moscow. The coastal dimension added another layer to this shift. This country does not field a massive navy. But modern naval warfare no longer depends solely on ships. It depends on denying access. Land-based anti-ship missile systems, paired with advanced coastal surveillance, can turn entire sections of sea into high-risk zones. Ukraine demonstrated this vividly by damaging and destroying Russian naval assets without matching fleet size. The lesson was clear, and it was applied quickly. As coastal defenses expanded, analysts began to describe the Western Black Sea not as open water, but as contested space. A place where Russian warships could no longer maneuver freely without constant risk. For Russia's southern strategy, this is critical. Naval freedom of movement underpins everything from deterrence to logistics. When that freedom is restricted, planning becomes reactive. Routes become predictable. Vulnerabilities multiply. At the same time, all of these upgrades were being integrated directly into NATO's command structure. Interoperability became standard. Exercises grew more complex. Joint operations moved from theory to practice. Every new system, air, land, or coastal, strengthened not just one military, but the alliance as a whole. That is the core problem Russia now faces. It is no longer dealing with a single country upgrading its defenses. It is confronting a NATO-embedded force capable of contributing to regional power projection. In military terms, this country shifted from being a consumer of security to a provider of it. For years, Moscow assumed the southeastern flank would remain secondary, protected by geography, limited by capability, and cautious by nature. Those assumptions no longer apply. What now stands on the western Black Sea is a modernizing force with advanced air power, strengthened ground units, and growing denial capabilities along the coast. And this modernization is still unfolding. Because while weapons and platforms changed the balance on paper, the real strategic shock for Russia would come next, when Allied forces began arriving in large numbers, and quiet bases turned into permanent hubs of power. That is where the transformation moved from national defense to alliance strategy. And that is where the pressure on Moscow truly began to rise. Military power is not defined only by weapons. It is defined by presence. For years, NATO's footprint along Europe's southeastern edge remained limited. Exercises came and went. Troops rotated. Infrastructure stayed modest. From Moscow's perspective, this flank looked reinforced on paper, but thin on the ground. That perception changed rapidly after Russian drones began crossing into Allied airspace and explosions echoed along the Danube. The alliance made a clear decision. This territory would no longer be treated as a peripheral zone. The most visible symbol of that decision emerged along the Black Sea coast, where a once quiet air base began transforming into one of NATO's most important military hubs in Europe. Runways were expanded, hangars multiplied, logistics facilities were modernized, housing and support infrastructure grew at scale. This was not preparation for short-term exercises. It was designed for permanence. According to Allied defense planning, the base is being structured to support thousands of personnel, including American forces, making it one of the largest Allied military installations in the region. From this single location, NATO can monitor the western Black Sea, support air policing missions, and reinforce the alliance's southern flank within minutes. For Russia, this represented a fundamental shift. Movements that once occurred at the edge of its awareness were now being observed continuously. Air activity, naval patrols, and missile tests faced near-constant monitoring. Strategic ambiguity began to disappear. Further inland, another system that Moscow has long viewed with suspicion gained renewed significance. A missile defense site, officially designed to protect against long-range threats, sits deep inside this NATO country. For years, Russia argued that such systems undermine regional balance. Now, that system exists within a state that is rapidly strengthening and fully integrated into NATO's command structure. From Moscow's perspective, this is not an isolated installation. It is part of a layered defensive network that complicates planning and shortens reaction time. But air bases and missile systems are only one side of the equation. The other is boots on the ground. A multinational NATO battle group is now permanently deployed in this country, led by a major European military power and supported by forces from multiple allied nations. This is not a symbolic presence. In military terms, it serves as a tripwire. Any aggression against this territory would immediately involve multiple NATO members. There would be no ambiguity about responsibility, no delay in response, and no space for limited escalation. Exercises conducted by these forces are not ceremonial. They focus on rapid deployment, border defense, combined arms operations, and joint command execution. The emphasis is on speed and coordination, exactly the capabilities needed in a high-risk escalation scenario. For Russia, this removes a familiar option, applying pressure without triggering a broader response. Logistics is another area where the balance has quietly shifted. Wars are not won only at the front lines. They are sustained by roads, railways, ports, and energy networks. NATO recognized early on that rapid reinforcement in southeastern Europe required serious infrastructure investment. As a result, highways were reinforced to handle heavy armored vehicles. Bridges were strengthened. Rail lines were upgraded under European defense mobility programs. Ports along the Black Sea received enhanced security and capacity. These upgrades serve civilian economies, but their strategic purpose is clear. In a crisis, large NATO formations can now move through this country faster than through almost any alternative route in the region. What was once a logistical bottleneck has become a corridor, and corridors matter. They determine how quickly forces arrive, how long they can stay, and how effectively they can operate. This logistical role becomes even more critical when looking north. Just beyond the border lies Moldova, a small country navigating between European integration and long-standing Russian influence. Within Moldova sits Transnistria, a separatist region hosting Russian troops under the banner of a frozen conflict. For years, this situation remained relatively static. But the war in Ukraine introduced a dangerous variable. If Russia were ever to attempt a land corridor connecting Crimea to Transnistria through southern Ukraine, the implications would be severe. Russian-controlled territory would extend directly to NATO's border. Allied forces would face immediate pressure to respond. Defense analysts often describe such a scenario as a geopolitical earthquake. In that event, the Black Sea NATO state would become the primary staging ground for Allied response, logistically, militarily, and politically. Its infrastructure, bases, and readiness would determine how quickly NATO could act. This is why every exercise, every deployment, and every infrastructure project in this country is closely monitored by Moscow. From Russia's perspective, the southeastern flank is no longer passive. It is organized, it is reinforced, and it is connected to the full weight of the alliance. Where Moscow once calculated on delay and division, it now sees speed and cohesion. This doesn't mean conflict is inevitable, but it does mean miscalculation carries higher risk than ever before. For Russia, the challenge is no longer just military capability. It is the system, a system that shares intelligence, deploys jointly, moves quickly, and treats the defense of one member as the responsibility of all. And this system now sits directly across the water from Crimea. But even with bases, troops, and logistics in place, one final dimension completes the picture, one that determines whether power can be sustained over time. That dimension is industry, energy, and information. And it is there that Russia faces perhaps its most difficult long-term problem. Military power can win battles, but endurance wins eras. That is the lesson Russia has learned, often the hard way, during the war in Ukraine. And it is precisely this lesson that the Black Sea NATO state has absorbed most effectively. Weapons and bases matter. Troops and alliances matter. But none of them mean much if a country cannot sustain itself when pressure lasts for months or years. That is where the final and most underestimated dimension of this transformation comes into play. Industry. For decades, this country's defense industry remained limited. Production lines were outdated. Ammunition capacity was low. Maintenance depended heavily on foreign facilities. In a prolonged crisis, these weaknesses would have quickly become liabilities. After 2022, that reality changed. Instead of treating defense production as a secondary concern, the government began rebuilding it from the ground up. Not symbolically, but structurally. New ammunition plants were planned and expanded. For the first time in decades, domestic gunpowder production returned as a national priority. Why does this matter? Because modern warfare consumes resources at an extraordinary rate. Artillery shells, missiles, drones, and spare parts are used faster than many countries can replace them. A military that depends entirely on external supply chains is vulnerable to disruption, delay, and political pressure. A military that produces at home is far harder to intimidate. Alongside ammunition, maintenance became a focus. Repair hubs were established for armored vehicles, artillery systems, and unmanned platforms. This reduced downtime and ensured combat systems could return to service quickly without leaving the country. Since the war in Ukraine began, NATO has expanded intelligence integration across southeastern Europe. This country has become a critical node in that network. Radar coverage intensified. Maritime surveillance expanded. Drone activity is tracked and analyzed. Cyber defense cooperation deepened. Information now flows in near real time across Allied systems. Movements in Crimea, the Black Sea Fleet, and southern Ukraine are no longer opaque. They are observed, assessed, and shared. For Russia, this creates a constant strategic disadvantage. Surprise becomes harder to achieve. Ambiguity disappears. Every move carries immediate consequences. The Black Sea is no longer a gray zone. It is a monitored theater. Taken together, these developments explain why this transformation matters far beyond one country. Russia is not facing a sudden crisis. It is facing a structural shift. A NATO state on its southern flank is now militarily modern, industrially resilient, energetically independent, logistically central, intelligence integrated, and all of it is embedded within a powerful alliance. This does not mean war is inevitable. It does not mean confrontation is desired. But it does mean that the old assumptions no longer apply. The Black Sea is no longer a comfortable space for unilateral influence. The southeastern flank is no longer a weak point, and quiet countries no longer remain quiet when security is at stake. For Russia, this is the real challenge, not a single weapon system or base, but the loss of strategic freedom over time. Because when preparation replaces hesitation and systems replace vulnerability, power quietly shifts. And by the time it becomes obvious, it is already too late to reverse.